Hello everyone and welcome to this new tutorial, in which we will talk about adjusting the pivot point. So we have already seen that when we select an object we want to transform, the gizmo moves on the object's origin. As a reminder, the origin of an object is this little orange dot here, which simply represents the position of the object in space. So the position of the origin corresponds to the XYZ location coordinates we can see in the Object Properties panel, values that can also be found in the Item tab. And when we rotate something, the rotation is done around the object's origin. This is why we have seen that it's better to place an object's origin where we want it to turn around, on a joint or articulation for instance. So to move an origin, we can use the option menu. By checking Transforms Affect Only Origins, and there we move the origin here. So now the gizmo is well positioned at the joint between the head and the neck, which allows us to turn the head in a logical way. The position of the gizmo, the point around which objects rotate, is called the pivot point. And so here our pivot point is positioned on the object's origin, but in this tutorial, we will see how to place the pivot point elsewhere than on any origin. And this is necessarily the case when you select several objects. If I select both the head and the crown, looks, the gizmo moved. Since we have two origins, the pivot point has not split itself to snap on each origin. Instead, we guess that it has moved between the two origins, and that seems quite logical. This is the default behavior. But we have another ways to position a pivot point using the menu called Transform Pivot Point. In this menu, we can see that we are currently using a pivot point mode represented by this small pictogram, with two hollow circles and a dot in the middle. So if we look for what the pictogram corresponds to, we can see that this mode is called median point. I don't really like having to make sense of small pictograms, so rather than using this menu, I use the semicolon or dot shortcut. It displays a radial menu, a bit like the one we use to set axis orientation, and here we can clearly see that we are using median point mode. So with the median point mode, the pivot point is placed at the midpoint of the segment formed by both origins of the selection. If I select a third object, the pivot point is positioned at the center of the triangle formed by the three origins. And if I select more than three objects, the pivot point moves to the center of the volume formed by all the origins of the selection. This is very handy when you don't need the pivot point to have a specific position, but this is not the only one behavior. If I need my objects to rotate around a position that I choose, for example, if we want to rotate the head, the crown, the piston, the neck, and the second piston, all objects will rotate around a pivot point which is not ideally placed, since I did not really specify its position. What if I would like the pivot point to be positioned on the neck first vertebra, for example? To do that, we can tell Blender to place the pivot point on the active element origin. Let's try that right away by going back to the Pivot Points menu with the semicolon shortcut, and there we choose the Active Element mode. So the active element, as a reminder, is the last object we selected with Shift key, and it's outlined with a light orange. So there the piston is the active element, so the pivot point is positioned on its origin, but since we want to use the vertebra's origin as the pivot point, I reselect the vertebra again, so that it becomes the active element. And now I can rotate all the objects of the selection with a pivot point positioned on the object's origin of my choice, and so obtain a rotation as I wish. So that's very convenient. We use this mode very often. We could also have parented all the objects as children of the vertebra. That way, we would just have to rotate the vertebra, and all the children objects would follow. But it depends on the situation. If, for example, these objects are not intended to be linked together, rather than creating a relationship link, doing our rotation, and undoing the relationship link afterwards, it's faster to set the pivot point like we did. Then we have the bounding box center mode. So this mode is more useful in edit mode, but I'll quickly show you how it works. So for that, we will use a little simpler objects to be schematic. So we're going to create small cubes. I'm going to duplicate this one to create 5 of them. Then I set the pivot point to a median point to show you the difference. If I select the 5 cubes using median point mode, we can see that the pivot point is placed in the center of the shape created by the origins. So here a kind of triangle. If I switch to bounding box center, Blender will draw an invisible box that contains all the object's origins. And the pivot point will be placed at the center of this square box, rather than the shape created by origins. So it's a little bit different, and to be honest, very situational. I confess that I almost never use this mode. Then we have the individual origins mode, and there it becomes interesting. To show you how it's work, we will manipulate these 3 thrusters. So here we are in individual origins mode, and if I scale the objects, each thruster uses its own origin as pivot point. So it's very convenient to make these kinds of small adjustments. To compare, I'll show you what it would have looked like with median point mode. It's not the same at all. Because here, the 3 thrusters are using the same pivot point located at the center of the selection. It's also interesting with rotations. Let's go back to individual origins mode, and let's switch to local orientation as well, and voila! Each object uses its own origin, which allows us to make very interesting adjustments like that. What is nice with this mode is that, in fact, it allows us to do in a single operation what we would have to do object by object if we did not have access to this mode. And in addition, by performing the transformation at the same time on the whole selection, we are sure to perform a rotation with exactly the same angle value. If we use this pivot point mode with objects belonging to a hierarchy, it's also interesting. Then I will create a hierarchy with this finger, for example, by making each joint a child of the joint that precedes it. And now if I rotate all of these 3 objects using individual origin pivot point, it gives us that. This is a surprising behavior. In fact, what is happening here is, the joint are transformed with 2 cumulative rotations. A rotation inherited from the parent object, which using the origin of the parent object. And this rotation is cumulated with another rotation around each joint's own origin. Very interesting for animating joints. Then we have another mode called 3D cursor. This one is great when you want to place the pivot exactly where you want, without having to use any origin. So for example, let's select the entire model without the elements of the base, nor the small cubes, and let's say we would like all the model to revolve around a very precise point located around there. So obviously with median mode, the pivot point is at the center of all the origins. It's very random. I have absolutely no control over where my pivot point is positioned. If we rotate the selection, it looks like this. This is not what I intended to do. Using what we learned in this tuto, we could select the base, whose origin is located roughly where I want to rotate, then switch to active element mode, and it pretty much works. But the base also rotates, which I didn't necessarily wanted, and on top of that, I could say that I wanted the pivot point to be exactly here, not on the origin of the base. So we could move the origin of the base here. So you see it's starting to become a bit boring. Then I move the origin, select again all objects including the base. And here it works, but I still need to rotate the base at the same time. So of course we can do that much more conveniently by using the 3D cursor mode. Let's select the objects again, being sure we are using 3D cursor mode. And now I can place the 3D cursor anywhere using this tool, or by doing Shift plus right mouse button. And there, the pivot point is placed on the 3D cursor. So I'm going to be able to put it exactly where I want it. So here, and if I rotate, all my selection is revolving around the 3D cursor. This is super convenient because I can very quickly move the 3D cursor anywhere to place the pivot point exactly where I want. And finally, we have a last mode, which is a checkbox called Only Location. So to illustrate the behavior of this option, let's go back to our little cubes. We're going to rotate them around a pivot point located here. So let's rotate these cubes and try to observe what's going on. So indeed, objects are actually rotating. Since before we rotated them, this cube was oriented quite straight, and after rotate, it has a different orientation. But if you look closely, they are not only rotating, they are also moving, a bit like the Earth around the Sun or like a carousel. So as the Earth position is not the same when it revolves around the Sun, the cube moves along a circular path. And moreover, we can clearly see here that X and Y location values are changing as well as Z rotation value. So when we do this kind of rotation, contrary to what happens when we do a rotation like this, where the object turns around itself but remains stationary, when we do a rotation with an off-axis pivot point, objects not only rotate, but also moves. And if we activate the Only Location option, we will be able to use the rotation tool only for the purpose of a circular translation, so there will be no rotation. And that gives us this. We can clearly see that objects are moving on the circular path, but their orientation remains at 0. With this mode, we can animate objects in a way, let's say a magic way, because we're not used to see objects rotating like that. To show you what I have in mind, I'm going to duplicate the cubes to create a kind of cube cloud or random flying cubes. You'll understand. So here I have my cube cloud and I'm going to duplicate this one. I disable location only mode for the moment. I reduce its size a little, and this one will be the center of rotation of these objects. Now we hide the phylactery and replace it with these objects. So I move the cubes to the hand pretty much like that. I first switch to active element mode and activate the Only Location. I use active element mode to rotate all objects around the center object. And there you go. It looks like some magic effect. Maybe a chronometering could look like that, this kind of thing. It's really a weird kind of kinetics, so it make me think of Necron technology. So, it's a little trick I found interesting. Perhaps this can be used for a future modeling. Here we have gone through all the pivot point adjustment modes. You will see later that it will be very useful to us. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching it, and see you very soon.